right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today is Wednesday, 11/20, and welcome to another episode of Investing Systems Trading Service Live. Today we're going to be looking at the market, looking at some of the open trades, and just basically sort of winging it here, casual like. And so, what I thought I would start out by doing is looking at the S&P 500 with this little trend line, a new trend line that I decided to put on this chart just because it's interesting how well it fits, right? That obviously doesn't mean that the market can't bust through this trend line and go up, which would negate it, but well, I won't say negate it, but it's kind of a valid trend line. It's not perfect, but the interesting thing about it is it goes back like a year, actually a little bit over a year, right? And I saw someone that had this trend line on their chart, and I thought, hey, that's kind of interesting, and really mostly because it's kind of an odd starting point, but you know the funny thing is that these two like near touches here. Well, actually there was a touch there. Um, make it so that the trend line, like literally, we've run up to it now, and so it may act as overhead resistance going forward. May or may not, right? I mean, here's the thing: when the market gets on these moves up like this, it has a lot of inertia, right? And here was one, and this one had quite a bit of inertia to it, and then even took a little dip and made a nominal higher high. And so once these things get started, now this one back at the beginning of the year was kind of unusual, if you ask me. This whole V reversal thing was about as strange as I've ever seen. After a 20% sell off, an immediate V reversal, all the way back to where it came from with barely a pause. That was a little odd, but anyway, this current rally that we got going on here is most likely, it's a result of a few things. The headlines keep talking about how, the whole trade war thing, right? Which, by the way, as of last night, past couple days, the trade deal that back here on the 10th, the trade deal was actually announced, right? Trump announced that we had a trade deal with China that was going to come in phases, and the Dow rallied 300 points and all that, and that kind of kicked off this thing. And it's becoming apparent up here that there actually is no trade deal yet, and I believe that it's potentially in jeopardy based on Congress passing some resolution about supporting Hong Kong or whatever. It's going to make China mad. But anyways, regardless of all that, you got three Fed rate cuts here. And of course, you got the Fed expanding their balance sheet by $60 billion a month. And so that's what a lot of people out there are saying is the reason for this rally. Fed liquidity, right? Regardless of that, it's been a pretty amazing rally. And one of the things I'm looking at here, is one of the things I've been looking at here is the RSI, right? Actually, this should be a daily chart right here. There we go. I switched it to a weekly because I wanted to see what the weekly RSI looked like, but there's your daily RSI. And typically RSI over 70 is doesn't necessarily mean that you're due for a correction, but it's usually not a really good place to start getting long the market, right? Crazy thing is that way, way, way back in, there we go, January of 2018, we had that sort of melt up rally, right? I can't recall a time seeing the RSI. It was at 87 basically. It might have been higher than that, but well, no, that looks like sort of the peak there. 80 87. That looks like it. Anyway, I mean that's just nuts. And so that kind of does show it started from overbought anyway. And you can see that, this little spot, whoops, this little spot right here, um, RSI was over 70, and then it just went, and it was a melt up, right? So, anyway, in the past, you get RSI up over 70, and it's time to, the market's just overbought, right? And of course, the market can stay overbought for a long time. Here's a case where you had the market overbought for period of time here, maybe a couple of weeks or whatever, and then you got an actual sell-off over here. Poked over 70, and then you got a little bit of a sell-off, and so that's just something to keep your eye on. Obviously, market's overbought. We're in one of those periods now where everybody thinks, just it seems like the conventional wisdom is that nothing can bring this market down. What was interesting yesterday about the Dow as opposed to the S&P is that the Dow had big run up and then like this bearish engulfing candle, right? So that was a little interesting. The S&P, look at the SPY here. S&P opened down today and is acting extremely resilient here. It's been a really small, like sort of really small range here, like a 3.5 point range since the open in the first half hour. So not much going on today, but the resiliency in the market is just absolutely incredible. And so I don't know what to make of it. I don't know if it's going to be able to bust out above this trend line over yesterday's high, but nothing would surprise me. So until until we see some real selling come in, right? Um, we haven't seen a lot of selling here. I mean, we've only had there's literally only been 3 down days in November. Yesterday was one of them. Pretty incredible since the 20th. So anyhow, what I wanted to do was I wanted to take a look at where we are with some of the trades here. Interestingly enough, right now there is, let's see, pending trades. There's only 4 pending trades, right? And that typically means that we're at the top of a cycle. The way that the software works is that we go through these cycles, right? And so you get like a pullback in the market, a down cycle, and a whole bunch of stocks start showing up on the pending list, and then the market kind of does its thing. And in a down cycle, like you get a down cycle, like just say over here, right? Maybe you got maybe there's a bunch of stocks that are open, and then market starts pulling back. This was pretty dramatic. These are some long range days, and they start pulling back and hitting trailing stops, and or everything's down, and so you don't get any new ones triggering in, and so the pending list tends to get filled up with a bunch of stocks that are waiting for an upcycle. And so then we get an upcycle like this, and a whole bunch of stocks, they start triggering in as they start closing above their trigger price. And so the list of open trades keeps growing. And then, we get up here, and there's very few pending trades, a lot of open trades. And so, the cool thing is that eventually, when we get a market pullback, we'll see a whole nother batch of trade setups come in. And so And so, I mean, that's kind of how the system just works through its cycles. The trajectory of this rally here is pretty incredible, honestly. There's a couple ways to draw it, but this is a pretty steep rally. This is one of those. It seems like there's a relentless sort of bid under this market, right? And those always come to an end, right? They always come to an end, but the market has what I call inertia, and until such a time when we see, the first little key here to me, and I talked about this a little bit last week, but there you go. The first little key here, and you're starting to see a little bit of, starting to see maybe some yellow flags here, right? Like the MACD. The momentum is sort of waning here a little bit. You can see that MACD sort of headed down towards the zero line, and the MACD moving averages are starting to get pinched together, right? The momentum's waning. You had the RSI, you know, RSI a couple days on Monday was up to 74, and so you can't really tell anything until the end of the day. But one of the things I look at is this thick black line is my favorite short-term moving average. You guys know that's the 9 EMA, which corresponds with the 9 EMA in the MACD. And so as you can see, we haven't had a close below the 9 EMA since this day, and which consequently was the day when Trump announced that we had a trade deal with China phase 1, right? And so anyhow, that's that. So basically with the 9 EMA, the thing to look at is whether most of the price action is occurring above the moving average or below it, right? So the first little tip off here will be when you start to see like some pokes below it, and then like maybe like back over here. One of the things I look for is like an entire day below it. Now this was a lot of news driven craziness here, right? Big up days, big down days. And so it's a little bit, but with the trending market, when you get these trends above and then below the 9. And so right now, we're in sort of an uptrend above the 9, haven't poked below it, but that'll be one of the warning signs, right? So until you see the price break below that 9, we're still in a short-term uptrend here. So anyhow, back to the charts of the open trades. And so a few of these have been open for a while, and we still have this that is one stock that's been open since the middle of October. Let's take a look at that. GMS. Yeah, GMS, good looking stock, right? I've used this as an example quite a few times. And the thing about this is that it's kind of been it's spent a lot of time sort of moving sideways within the context of an actual longer term uptrend. I mean it's been sort of all over the map, and it's had one, two, three consolidations and actually like sort of pullbacks since it triggered. But lo and behold, and look at these days here: up, down, up, down, up. It's pretty volatile. And so, you're talking a couple of bucks, right? A couple of bucks per day. And what's amazing about this, and this is really kind of I would say that this is kind of an unusual example or an unusual sort of trade. I mean, it's looking great, right? Obviously, this is one we talked about where close, when it triggered in, trigger price here was 28.50, and the day that it triggered in, it closed a little bit above the trigger price. Like the following morning, the idea is you wait for the stock to close above the trigger price, you look to get in the following morning, as long as it's over the trigger price, right? And so it was, can't call it 50 cents, right? Trigger's 28.50. Next morning it opens at, right around 29, and so 50 cents not a big deal, right? So this is the one I've been using as an example where with the target being up here at 30.50, you just add another 50 cents to it and call it 31, right? And so, if you got in 50 cents higher, then your target's up here at 31. But the most interesting thing about this particular stock is how these stops have worked out, right? I mean, typically I draw a little stop, I draw the trailing stop on here, and I draw it like over, 3 days, say, right? Because the trailing stop tends to ratchet up, ratchet up, ratchet up really quickly, as I'll show you in another example here. But on this particular one, um, its trailing stop was just far enough away that this pullback right here, right? And keep in mind that we're using the monthly ATRs for this, and so you can see that this stock typically has a pretty long range day on a daily basis. The stop was just far enough away to keep us in for this 2 day pullback, and then of course it rallied back up. But what was interesting is it literally stayed. That stop stayed at 29 bucks, just far enough away to keep us in on these couple of pullbacks here, right? And this was a pretty long range day, and then only after it rallied up here did this stop like ratchet up again, and and so same sort of thing. We had another pullback. We've had these couple of days here, and so this stop is stayed at 30. It's still at 30 bucks, right? And so it started off at, well, it's not started off. It had ratcheted up to 30 over here, and all these days later, it's still trapped right there at 30. So it'll be interesting to see if it ratchets up again today after the close, and I have a feeling that's going to have a lot to do with what the price does today. But it's still a real interesting example of how that trailing stop just perfectly sort of managed, and how it works, right? Keep us in. And so the idea, I mean, this one clearly hit the target, and there was ample opportunity to pull some off the target, but still looking pretty good. So it's really sort of interesting because it's been open, like I say, since 10:15. It triggered in on 10:15, and so every other stock that's on the open list here has triggered in November. Oh, I take that back. There's another one here, WST. This one triggered in at the very end of October, 28th, 29th. So, and this one's looking pretty good too. This is another sort of interesting one because again, the trailing stop sort of had ratcheted up all these times, right, as the price moved, and then it's paused here at 146, right? So the price rallied up, hit the target, and then once it hit the target, it's been sort of vacillated sort of sideways here for 8-10 days really, and so this stop ratcheted up to just below this price action and has basically stuck there as of right now. This trailing stop, because I put this on here last night. I went through all of them, and I extended this trailing stop to include today, and so it's another interesting sort of example here too. Beautiful, beautiful looking stock. There's a couple of actually a few sort of days that are outside the range, right? If I put this on a candlestick, if I put it on a candlestick chart, you can see that there's some crazy days in here, like this one in particular. Now this little run up here and this little topping candle which kicked off the pullback. Um, a few days prior to the thing triggering in was sort of a wild day too, and that could have been earnings, right? I mean, we're just on the tail end of earnings season here. So anyway, so far so good. I had even gone as far as to draw like a little sort of downtrend line, which sort of makes sense when you look at the pattern here. And so stock. This is exactly what we're looking for, right? We're looking for a stock that primary uptrend has a pullback, and then the uptrend resumes. And so, here we are. This particular stock is like right back up near the highs here, right? And so, I mean, it's looking pretty darn good, quite honestly. You can see that we're getting a consolidation here well above the actual target. Well, it's well above, a couple of bucks, $2.5 above the target. And so it's looking like it's just sort of consolidating, and we shall see if it can bust out here. This is actually a beautiful sort of a cup pattern, and so it's just a matter of obviously what the market does here too, right? So we're about to find out if the market, we're hitting the low of the day. So today's actually, a down day. We had a down day yesterday, and this market may be ready to take a little breather, as they like to say on CNBC. When the market's down, they call it taking a breather. The market's resting. Anyway, so that's the other one that was open in October. So both of those looking great. This GMS right here, let me look. Earnings are on 12/5. So this one, depending on what it does, if it breaks out or whatever, earnings out here on 12/5. That's still a long ways away. You never know. I mean, the thing could, this thing could just keep going, and so there's still plenty of time between now and December 5th. But this one still has not released earnings yet. There's actually a couple of open trades that have yet to release earnings. The other one is Lulu, right? Look at Lulu. What a beauty. Interestingly enough, Lulu, and we talked about this I think at length last week, right? This is the second swing trade in a row on this particular stock. This current run up here is incredible. It really is. It basically had this sell off, which was very short lived. It's a few days, and this pivot low, and it turned right back around, and has just literally been marching higher. Parabolic stops. We haven't seen a whole lot of parabolic stops kick in recently for whatever reason, and obviously it's just sort of the nature of the market marching higher because we haven't seen any real extreme sort of moves. But I was starting to wonder about this one because that's a pretty I would say that's a pretty not extreme move, but I guess you could characterize the past these couple of days. This maybe this was the parabolic day, right? This is when sort of a march higher turned into like a parabolic move, and that's why that stop kicked in. So today's low is 216.29, and so anyway, the parabolic stop is designed obviously that's a good place to lock in some profits. Obviously the target you want to key off selling some at the target, but when the parabolic stop kicks in, it's not a bad idea to just say to just go ahead and close it out. Now sometimes like today, the parabolic stop got hit by 1 penny, right? Let me see what the 5 minute looks like here. Yeah. um, basically like right at the open, boom. If you had a hard stop in at the parabolic stop, it would have taken you out 216.29, and so let me move that. There we go. Interestingly enough, if you had a hard stop in, which I'm gonna guess that that's kind of a rare thing because I mean typically you obviously want to have a hard stop in at the trailing stop. With the parabolic stop, it's more of if you start to break down below that, then it's a good place to just go ahead and lock in the profits. But in the past, we've seen cases where the parabolic stop keeps kicking in and the stock just keeps going higher. So anyway you slice it, it's turning out to be a pretty good trade. What's interesting about this is how the trailing stop is sort of hanging back, right? In theory, like being in this one, and by the way, this is another one that officially triggered in slightly higher than the trigger price because it closed over the trigger price. So this day here opened at 207 and change. So a couple of bucks on a $200 stock, not a big deal. And so add a couple of bucks to that target and basically you'd be up here. So anyways, this is it's up here in profit taking territory and looking pretty good. It would not surprise me to see this thing either start to chop around sideways. Well, look at what it did back over here. It did the same thing. It ran up really quick, had sort of a big move, and then it just kind of went sideways there and sold off, basically with the rest of the market. So there you go. Anyway, Lulu looking pretty good. Second trade in a row. Can't complain about that. So now let's move on here down the list. RNG looking pretty good here. You can see that trailing stop has been ratcheting up to a pretty good spot. There's the trigger in day. So triggered right around it would have been available to get in right around the trigger price. So, and right now, as we speak, the trailing stop has made it all the way up to the exact trigger price. And so that's basically what you want to see, right? Once the trailing stop has ratcheted up to break even, then everything's good, right? No risk in the trade. And so, here's another one that's it's looking pretty good today. And it's kind of getting up here. It's going to start bumping around these prior highs back here. And so this is a pretty good spot for the trailing stop to be up at break even because it's going to run into some resistance right around these highs up here. So I'll just go ahead and just for the fun of it, I'll just put a horizontal line up there. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean it can't break out. It could spend the next couple of weeks sort of bouncing around up here, or it could just plow right through these highs. You never know. But it is about to encounter some resistance. So, it's a good time to have this thing at break even. Going down the list here, I mentioned last week, right? That there was a bunch of home builders on the pending list. This was the first one to trigger in. And so what was pretty amazing is that, and we'll take a look at the rest of them, but what was amazing is that we had, this home builder, William Lyon Homes, and this was the first one to trigger in here on this day, closed above the trigger. This was kind of an anomaly too because this particular day down, see this trigger price right here. this trigger price was basically being based off of these these ranges right here, right? It was looking for the stock was in a pullback, and so the trigger price was sort of assuming that you're getting some consolidation here, pullback consolidation, then you get that one sort of outrageous sort of fake out, right? And this may have been earnings, but anyway, so the system was calculating, okay, we're going to put the initial stop below sort of the low of the pattern, what you'd call the pivot low, right? And it just so happened that it was an anomaly day. And so that initial stop went down there, and then boom, like it triggered in the next day, and then literally like the following day the trailing stop all the way back up to to under, actually it was a little bit above this low right here. That low was 1964, and this trailing stop was at 1970. And so anyway, it's kind of an anomaly, but it's also a good example of why you don't want to get too hung up on the initial stop, because a lot of times, not always, I mean obviously it depends on the price behavior, but a lot of times that initial stop is basically just being set below the pattern, and then immediately the very next day it will adjust itself to to where it should be. I guess I could say. I think I've seen some cases where the initial stops, obviously in lots of them, it's in a perfect place, but sometimes it seems in a case like this, it would seem that it was too far outside of the range, but it's just a calculation, and then the following day, within a day or so, you're going to see it adjust to what should be normal, and so here we are. So this stock is this was the first home builder to trigger in, and you can see that it's slowly resuming the uptrend here. Now this is kind of a weird chart because this thing's moving in very small increments. 25 cents, are these increments here. So I mean this thing's moving, you know, 50, 75 cents a day. Not extremely volatile. It was the first home builder to trigger in. After we get through Nike here, here's Nike. Is probably another really super cool example of, and I talked about this one at length the past couple of weeks because of this pattern here, right? And as you recall, it was last Wednesday we were sitting here looking at this, and Nike was like had pushed above the trigger price. I extended the trigger all the way over there last week. Um, and I drew this just basically sort of pointing out, what the system was looking for, and the funny thing is that it basically manifested in the exact way that I was talking about, right? So it's just kind of unusual. But if you guys were watching last week, I drew like this channel here, and I extended the trigger price over, and I was like, look, looking for a pullback, consolidation, and then a turn back higher, and so that's exactly what happened here. And so this was last Wednesday right here, right there when we were talking about it, and then so you know, following morning opens up here. Took a poke at the trigger price for you folks that like to get in at the exact trigger price by setting a limit order. The open there was at 91.49, so an extra 50 cents, no big deal. What I haven't drawn on here yet is the target, and so let's see, target 90 is already hit the target. I just hadn't drawn it on here yet. So target at 94. I'm going to put that down here just a little bit. Yeah, there we go. I was looking at it and I was like, there's something doesn't look right, and so there you go. Target 94. The targets are targets are based on the monthly ATR of the stock, and slightly under 3 ATRs we found is a good hit rate, right? And three ATRs is it's a good, and the thing about the target, this is like our initial target, our target one, and we want to get we want to see a really high hit rate on the target. There's no point in setting a target if hardly any of them actually hit the target, and obviously the target needs to be something reasonable, right? And so we came up with the calculation of, and I don't know the exact calculation, but it's just slightly under 3 ATRs. If you take it up to 3 ATRs, then you get there's like a real sort of fine tuning to it. 3 ATRs, a lot of times they almost make it 3 ATRs, but not quite. So you bring it slightly down, just under 3 ATRs, and get an extremely high hit rate on the targets, right? So Nike looking pretty good. It's interesting how it sold off and then spent several weeks like consolidating in this range, and then once it broke out of that range, I mean it really got a pretty good directional move higher, right? I mean turned into, it's like a U-turn. And so there you go. The initial stop was slightly higher than the low of the pattern, but it was basically like right under this congestion here, so that looked pretty good, and started off a little slow, ratcheting up, but here you go. um, and so the idea of the trailing stop obviously is to give the stock enough wiggle room where you can have a few days of normal price fluctuation without knocking you out, because some of these things, like the one we looked at earlier, I mean, you can the one we looked at earlier, GMS, has been open for a month now, right? And so, go back to that. We didn't get knocked out by this normal price fluctuation, right? The trailing stop knew to hang back just enough, and so here we are, and so still looking pretty good, and still has a lot of potential. So each case is a little bit different, but the theory is still the same, and of course, it's always fun when you have these big cap brand name stocks like Nike and Lulu that you hear people talking about, and of course, they're always bullish on this stock on CNBC no matter what. Everybody loves Nike, right? So there you go. All right, so let's work our way down the list here, and to the ones that have triggered more recently. And like I said before, I believe there's like 5 home builders, and I remember saying last week, hey, there's all these home builders. We looked at the pending stocks. It's like there's all these home builders, so you may just want to. It wouldn't kind of make sense really to buy a whole bunch of home builders, be holding 5 different home builders. So basically, it was kind of more of a pick and choose type thing. KB Homes, nice orderly run up, nice orderly pullback, uptrend theoretically resuming, right? And so here we are. This thing triggered in, trailing stop, initial stops hung back a few days there, and as this stock's moving higher, trailing stops ratcheting up. Target on this 36.40. Go ahead and mark that on here just so we have it. Yeah, sometimes when these things when they first start trigger in and start going, I don't actually put the target on there right away. Some of them I do, some of them I don't, but it just depends. Anyway, gives you kind of a decent perspective on it to see where that target is. So some of these home builders that have just triggered in the past week or so, they're just getting started, and so you can see a nice sort of little stair step up here. My guess is, and I mean, just for the fun of it, I'll go ahead and I'll just go ahead and put my little spot on here, and then tonight after the update, I will. I'm gonna assume that it's gonna look something like that, and so I mean that's the idea, right? Start off and give the stock enough wiggle room so that it could, if the market go, we haven't had a pullback in the market, like a real pullback in a long time, and so the idea is that the initial stop and the trailing stops want to give it enough room for a normal sort of market pullback without getting knocked out on just a couple of down days. And so there you go. Let's see. Got a couple of more home builders here. Give me 1 second here. All right, so there you go. KB Homes. Next up, Meritage Homes. Sort of this one's actually I'm looking at the I've got the whole list in my Thinkorswim here. This is actually the biggest loser, or I don't say the biggest loser, but the biggest percentage loser of the day. I keep using that term. And so, thing about this is, you get a run up, you get a couple of down days. This could turn around today. It could come down for another day, rally back up. So just because I see this pattern doesn't mean that it's a goner. And so, and plus, here's the stop here, 68.50, buck and a half away from the trigger price, maybe a couple of bucks away from what would be the entry. So, not a huge big deal. Obviously, unless it's ready to take a whole nother leg down. So, the thing about these home builders is that like that one there looks a little bit rough. These other ones look pretty good. KBH looks great. This one looks pretty darn good too. This one is just kind of marching higher, orderly fashion. And I mean, look at this uptrend here, right? Real nice, persistent uptrend. And back over here, there was I don't know what happened here, but it triggered in and then hit the trailing stop. It's like 75 cents or whatever, right? No huge big deal, but there was that big down day right there, and that could have been like an overall market sell off, or it could have been a day when when housing numbers came out and the home builders got smacked real hard. But it's funny because basically, after that happened, it had a little bit of consolidation and then just a perfect sort of persistent run up. And so, the system put it back on the pending list after this little pullback. And so we shall see whether we get another persistent move higher like we did back over here. And so, I mean, conceptually, that's the idea. We're looking for stocks that are in persistent uptrends. We look for a pullback, and then we look for a trend resumption. And so there you go. Conceptually, that's a really valid sort of way to do things, right? So there we go. Interesting sort of pattern that created the anomaly there. So actually, all these home builders are looking pretty good, right? There's Lennar. Lennar triggered in and is just kind of hanging here, right? Just kind of hanging in sideways, but it's a real similar type of thing. Persistent uptrend, then a big rally up the highs here. And it's funny, we had the same thing happened over here. Huh. I'm gonna have to go back and look and see what caused the home builders to have that big down day back there. Not that it really matters, but whatever it was very short lived because they all went into nice uptrends subsequently. So there you go, Lennar looking okay. I mean, this thing's just triggered in a couple of days ago. We looked at we looked at PHM. We looked at MTH. MTH is sort of the rough looking one out of the whole group. KBH. KBH looking pretty good. I think the KBH might out of the whole group might be the one that I think looks the best. So then, last but not least, we have Generac again, and yeah, we talked about this last week. This is kind of this is a little bit of an anomaly too because they released. We were in this thing, and then we had to close it out ahead of earnings, and it had this crazy earnings move, and just barely. It's not even a pullback. It was more of a consolidation, and it went right back on the list based on. I believe it went right back on the list based on this like sort of nice narrow range consolidation after the earnings came out, and so it happened to trigger back in on sort of an anomaly type day, I guess you could say. Because typically, what would have happened is it would have got put back on the pending list, right, after the earnings came out and a few days went by. The following week, it would have gone on this list, expecting sort of, and I mean, this was a pullback, right? I mean, it's the high here, and see that the system obviously is using data; it's just using numbers, and so the high here was 98.37, and then you come back over here and the low's 91.06, right? And so I mean that's almost a 10% difference, and so the system was saying, hey, I'm detecting a pullback in this stock of 10%, and so it's kind of interesting. And the fact that it happened in one day from high to this low, but it did have to wait a few days before it put it back on the list. But anyway, so I mean here it is. Like, right now it's basically like literally like it's 10 cents over the trigger price. Totally viable right here. Totally viable. Right? This is a beautiful stock. Stocks get squirrely around earnings as we talk about, and so that's why we closed. It got closed ahead of earnings where I have it circled right here, right, right where I have it circled here. That would have been the open on the day ahead of earnings, and then when they released earnings the following morning, it had a huge gap down and a huge rally, and so anyway, looking pretty good again, quite honestly, and if I take and draw like a little if I draw like a little downtrend line across these highs, and I like to use the open high low close bars. Look at that. I mean, this trigger here seems just as viable, if not more so, right now than it did back over here. Like back over here, it was a little. Now there's a chance. See, here's the thing. There's a chance back over here that had the same sort of like a little triangle pattern, and so it was completely viable. It got put back on the list because it's completely viable stock and pattern. Sometimes you get a day like this, and then the next couple of days you get a couple more bars like this, like kind of back over here, right? And so that trigger was basically viable. It just it's sort of a luck of the draw. Sometimes you get the folds right back over. Sometimes it continues on. But now that it's had this little bit of consolidation here, um, and it's sort of breaking out of here, it's looking pretty good. It's looking pretty good right around the same trigger price. So if you were, and here's the thing is that I say that it's still a completely viable trade right here, right now, today. So there you go. By the way, Generac makes generators, right? I'm pretty sure everybody's familiar with what this company does. And so I believe a lot of this run up here was due to the California wildfires, right? People were out rushing to buy generators, and because was it? They call it PG&E, shutting off people's power to millions of people, and so it probably, if your power is going to get shut off, then you want a generator, right? So there you go. Anyway, so everything looking pretty good here. All these open trades, bunch of home builders. I wouldn't really want to be in more than one or two of the home builders, to be honest with you. And so I pointed out which ones I thought looked the best. There's a couple of them. You got Lulu and Nike on here, and the GMS, of course, which has been we looked at, and so basically everything looking pretty good. The closed trades here. Um, Last thing I want to talk about here, real quick, is some of these closed trades. Now we just had this big upcycle, right? Just had this big upcycle in the market, and so it kind of goes to it makes sense that it makes sense since you go back down here to sort of the you can see that like Wendy's on here. Wendy's was opened on 10/4. You can see the entry dates here, right? And so this is a lot of the stocks that triggered in and opened in October and have gotten closed either based on earnings or based on them finally catching up to the trailing stops. But you can see that the system took pretty good advantage of this latest cycle up, and um, the thing to sort of focus on is the target and the max price, right? If the max price, which is the max price, is like the highest the stock moved, right? So if the max price is higher than the target, that means it hit the target, and so the majority of these did. And so I mean that's what I was talking about before, as far as like a high hit rate on the targets. That's what you want to see. So far, so good. Now I'm a little leery right now. We just had this big upcycle, right? Just had this big upcycle in the market, and so and got bunch of good closed trades under our belt, and so now that we have all these open trades here, and the market sort of in nosebleed territory, or overbought, I should say. It's going to be interesting. Now, I mean, the nice thing about it is a lot of these stocks, the ones that have been on here for a while, are they're basically going to have some of them have exceeded the target, and a lot of them are basically, even if the market does come back down, they will just hit the trailing stop at a decent profit. So it's the it's a few of these home builders here that move really, really slow that I'm a little concerned about. I mean, I'm not concerned about them, but the idea is that if we do get into a market correction, but here's the thing: the market can keep going. The market, it gets into these rally modes, and nobody can believe that it can just keep going up, and yet it does. Right? It happens all the time, and that's why letting the system do all the heavy lifting and the calculations and just sort of sticking with it and not trying to second guess what the market's going to do, it's turned out to be a pretty good strategy, because sometimes you get these run ups here and it just keeps going. So I just drew this on here just sort of as as a it's hard to want to this is all-time highs in the history of the world, and it's hard to want to get aggressive here, right? And so that's when you can choose to be as aggressive as you want or back off a little bit. My suggestion would be not to be holding more than two of those home builders, right? So And then obviously, if you've been in some of the other ones that have been open for a while, then you're plenty happy. This GMS, this is an incredible stock because, like, as we speak now, it's up 2.8% today, and yesterday it was down 2 something percent. I mean, this thing really has some volatility. I mean, the average range on this thing, like I was pointing out, is over a couple of bucks a day, and so it's if it can break out of this range, it can get something going, take another leg up. This is really going to look good. So kind of liking the look of this. This is exactly sort of how you want to be sitting in one of these positions, right? Trailing stop well above the trigger, well above the entry. Um, Plenty of opportunities up there at the target, and looking like it's ready to looking like it's perhaps ready to bust out again up in new highs. So there you go. Anyway, so that's what I got today. Nothing earth shattering, just sort of status quo. Take a look at the open trades, and so if you got any questions or whatever, shoot me an email, and I will see you guys here next week.